Everyone, and welcome as we continue our study through the New Testament. And today we are shifting gears. If you've been following along with us, we've been in the book of Acts, and we are doing this study chronologically. And so, because we're doing it chronologically, we're sticking to the historical timeline as much as we can, and the chronological timeline as much as we can, and also with some of the letters, the times they were written. And so so it's gonna infuse with the books of Acts, which is going to be interesting. Is as we're going through this, we've started in Acts, and we're going to go drop out of Acts, and then here go to James, and then we'll come back into Acts, and then we'll go out of Acts again, and I think Galatians, but I can't remember exactly the order. And so we'll go in and out of this until we get much later and get all the way through it. And so it's a really neat and interesting read of going through and getting a better understanding of how things kind of played out in the New Testament, the New Testament church. And the thing that we talked about too is to give you more of to help wrap our minds around the timeline of how things happen, how long they took to happen. I know sometimes when we sit down and read the Bible, we read the book of Acts or some of the other books, and it's like, oh, well, this stuff happened really quickly over a matter of just a year or two. And it's like, no, the book of Acts covers like 30 to maybe, I forget, I know it's at least 30 years. And so, because it's covering at least 30 years, that's a long time. So there's a lot that takes place. Like sometimes, in between verses is several years. And so we need to make sure that we do that. So again, because of the way this works, we're shifting into the book of James. And today I'm just giving an intro into James as we get into it. I didn't want to go too deep into all the reading and stuff, but I just wanted to hit straight into James, give you a little bit of background on who James is, who he was, and why he was writing James, and also hit on some little historical facts about James, and also talk about the differences with Paul and James, because if you read a lot of Paul's writings and then read James' writings, they almost seem to contradict each other. But if you understand the context of who and what they're writing about, then it makes sense. It makes sense, and you see that there's not a contradiction there. And so we'll start today, James 1:1. This will be the shortest reading I think that we have in this entire study and series. But it's James 1:1. It says, "This letter is from James, a slave of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ. I'm writing to the 12 tribes, Jewish believers scattered abroad. Greetings." And then tomorrow we'll get into the deeper parts of James. But just to kind of give you some background and some understanding of James. So James was actually, this is James, Jesus's brother, not James the apostle. We know, if you've been studying along with us, we know James the apostle has been killed. And so he was the first apostle to be martyred. And so we know that. So this is James, the brother of Jesus, and he is writing as a leader of the Jerusalem church. We're going to find out when we hop back into Acts that James is actually one of the leaders of the Jerusalem church. And so he's writing to the Jewish Christians who've been scattered and persecuted abroad. And so we're going to see this, right? And so he's encouraging them to endure the trials with fortitude and to exhibit constant Christian character. There's one thing that I love about James is it really, and this is where I think you can see that James was Jesus's brother. I'm sorry, because he really pulls out a lot of the things that I think sometimes we miss in Christianity. When it comes, we get a lot of the technical details right. We get a lot of the technical things right, but man, we miss the who we're supposed to be sometimes, and James calls us to that, and James is a good reminder, and I like that. And so the recipients of this letter were Jewish Christians. We see that in James 1:1, who had been scattered by the persecution that began with the stoning of Stephen. So we see that there was that scattering that happened. And so one of the things too that I wanted to point out about James, and I think I've talked about this before, is after Jesus's resurrection, after Jesus's resurrection, James became a believer and rose to this position, leadership in Jerusalem church. If you were with our study last year when we went through the Gospels, you noticed that there, a lot of Jesus's brothers kind of mocked him, made fun of him a little bit, weren't true believers. But then we see that shift after the resurrection. And so this letter of James, the letter of James, is one of the earliest books of the New Testament. This was probably the first, looking at everything, this was probably the first book in the New Testament that was written. Now, it's, we was like, well, what about Matthew, Mark, Luke? Those were actually written a little bit later on. than what James would have been. But, timeline wise, and that's what we're trying to hit chronologically. We're not reading them in the order they were written. We're trying to read things in the order that they actually happen. Timeline wise, obviously Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John happened first, but the letters of James was written actually before those would have been written as well. And so it's an interesting perspective to see that. And so more than likely, it was written sometime after Herod Agrippa killed James, the apostle, but prior to when Paul wrote Galatians. So that Herod killed James in around AD 44 that we know. The Galatians was written probably somewhere around AD 48, 49. And so we know it also was written before the council in Jerusalem, which we haven't studied yet, which was AD 49 to 50. So it's somewhere, most scholars believe around 45 AD is when this was written. So somewhere in between 44 and 48. The other thing, like I've mentioned as well, right, with James, is there does seem, if you read some of Romans and some of Paul's writings, right, there does seem to be a apparent difference between James and Paul regarding what we call good works, right? So it must be understood that we're writing in a different historical and theological context. A lot of times, sometimes Paul was writing to people who were trying to be there was a force of Gentiles from the Jewish people trying to force them to be circumcised to follow Jewish customs. And so Paul writes a lot about the law and how, we are saved by faith through grace, not of works, nothing of your own. Okay. And so he focuses in on that because he needs to, which is true. We're not saved by works. James doesn't ever say we're saved by our works. And so we're going to dive into that as we go into it. So Paul emphasized that you could not get right with God by obeying the law. That was his focus. His focus was you cannot obey the law and become right with God by it. Now, actually, technically you could if you obey the law perfectly. And since no one can obey the law perfectly, then no one can be made right through that. Or, so nothing we can do can save us. Nothing we do saves us. And so we need to understand that. And so only God through his grace, right, can overcome the problem of human sin. We can't overcome human sin on our own. And so we have to respond in faith. So both Paul and James believe this, but they differed in their emphasis. There's a reason why James does this, and we'll look at it as we go through it. Paul emphasized that works of the law do not produce salvation, which is true, right? And so he was opposed to the circumcision of Gentiles and other things that the Jews were trying to force the Gentiles to do. James emphasizes that faith cannot be reduced to a mere affirmation of truth. And I'll get this because we see and we hear things like, oh, call on the name of the Lord and you'll be saved, right? Now there's truth to that, but it can't just be a simple, oh, I've called on the name of the Lord and now I'm saved, I'm good, I can do whatever I want, I don't have to. And so James focuses on that and says faithfulness does not allow, right, for a divided allegiance between God and the world, right? You can't just, say, oh, and this was James' emphasis. You can't just say, oh, I have faith, I'm a believer, but not have any proof of that. No works that produces that. And so true biblical faith will always produce good deeds that would be pleasing to God. And so that's what we're going to see as we go through this, right? And it can be kind of a gray area, or I don't say a gray area, but it's not really gray. It can be like a cloudy area, I don't know, blurry area, like you blur these two, because it's hard sometimes. It's like, okay, we know that our works don't save us, but we know that if we have a true faith, then that faith is going to be a faith that produces good works. And so that's what we have to look at. And so whenever we read this and look at James, and James says faith without works is dead, right? That's what he means. That, again, the things we do not save us. Like, we're not going to get any, like, it doesn't make us any more saved than the next person through our faith, right? It's the faith in Jesus that saves us. But what James is going to focus in on, and what he's going to show, is that because we have a true faith, and a true faith produces good works, because a faith without any works is a dead faith. And so we're going to look into that and see. So it's going to give us a little bit of insight into that. And I'll hit that some more. And then when we get to Paul's letters, and when it talks about we're saved by grace and not by works and those type of things. And where his focus is on the law, he is focused on the law and the law that was given the Old Testament, right? Whereas James is not focused on the law. He's focused on, hey, if you truly do believe, then you're going to do these good things, right? It's going to be proven. You're going to see fruit of that. And so, again, they if you read both of them, that you could seem, oh, well, these are contradiction, but you have to understand Paul 1 is writing about the law and the works of the law, whereas James is talking about the works, what I would call the fruit of a true faithfulness, true faith in Christ Jesus. So the other thing that we're going to dive into, that we're going to see here, is that in James, is it gives us into an insight into the very early communities of Christian Jews especially. So we'll get a little bit of an insight there. And then I think more than anything, and I think this will be more helpful, I think, today and as we go forward, especially in our current environment, our current political environment, our current worldly environment, it helps us understand how Christians should live when they're the minority group in the midst of an oppressive non-Christian society. Because here's the thing, we like to talk about how America is a Christian nation and all this thing. Well, that if you really want to look at it, we're not anymore. Right? I think Obama said back in 2008, I think it was, that we were no longer a Christian country. Whether you like that idea that he stated it or not, it's true, right? If you look at our country as a whole, for the most part, we're getting further and further away from being a Christian nation. And so I think we're getting to a point in America, at least, where being a Christian, you're probably getting closer and closer to being in a minority group. And so we're going to look at how do we behave in that, right? Because I'll be honest with you, the current political environment, the current, status, a lot of Christians aren't behaving properly when it comes to that. It just is what it is. And you may not like to hear that, but I see a lot of political stuff that is downright ominously hateful and coming from Christian people. And it shouldn't be. And so sometimes it's from churches, sometimes it's just from people who call themselves Christians or people who claim to be Christians. But that's not what we're called to do, and that's not what we should look like. So we're going to look at that and say, hey, as Christians in this, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what aisle you're on, left or the right. How should we be behaving as Christians in this environment? And as things progress, how should we be and how do we say? And James has a lot of the answers for that as we go through that as well. So I hope this introduction helps. Or maybe you learned something from it that you didn't know before. But I hope you kind of get the insight into this as we study through it and dive into it, because sometimes James is overlooked, right? Sometimes it's overlooked. And I don't think sometimes we understand the importance of how really good this letter is and how wonderful it is, because Paul gets a lot of attention because Paul, being who he is, wrote a lot of the letters, and they're really, really good. They're really, really intellectual. Paul's writings were very intellectual, whereas James, I like James' style, is it's just down to earth. Just, hey, this is how it is. This is how we should behave. Very simple, and to the point, and good. Oh, and another side note, it's an interesting thing. The book of James was because of and we'll talk on this a little bit too. During the Reformation period, Martin Luther actually wanted to remove the book of James because of it's his call to works, right? That faith without works is dead, and what he says about works. So it's an interesting thing that we'll hit on a little bit as we go through it. But I'm glad it's there. It should be. It's a really important book of the Bible that we need to make sure we pay attention to as we go through this. So I hope you enjoyed as we get started in it. So as always, I appreciate everyone who takes the time to watch these. If you haven't subscribed to our channel, go ahead and do so. Again, we do these every day. We put out a little 5, 10, 15 minute Devo. Just depends on the writing, and the text, how deep we go, and how long some of these videos are. But you wouldn't miss it. Again, we're just starting in James, so if you want, you can go back and catch it up where we started, and actually start at the beginning of the year. But if you want to just start from here, you can start from here as well. And so again, I hope you're enjoying it. I hope everyone is learning from it. I learn from it every time I go through little facts that I find and things I see that I didn't see before. So I enjoy it. But as always, I appreciate everyone for taking the time to watch.